So let's talk about investing in stocks outside of the United States. There's many reasons to consider this. There's some great companies around the globe, and Vanguard makes it really easy to own basically all of them. And that is in an ETF, ticker symbol VXUS. That is what we're going to talk about in today's video. Stick around and let's see if this is a good investment for you. All right, so welcome back. This is Joshua Talks Money. I'm so glad you found my channel. Here I share stories about personal finance, all the things that I've learned and the things I'm still learning about money with you every week right here. I'd love for you to consider subscribing, hitting that like button. It helps me out tremendously. It takes 2 seconds. I'd really appreciate it. And let's talk about today's topic, which is international stocks, specifically the Vanguard International Stock ETF VXUS. Now, Vanguard offers about 12 exchange-traded funds that capture global stocks. And I've done a couple videos on these, the VWO, which is the Emerging Markets ETF, and more recently VT. This is the Global Stock ETF, which does have the US, but also all of these other stocks around the world. But today we're going to think about the strategy of investing in stocks everywhere except for the US, and that is what VXUS does. In fact, the ticker symbol kind of has that X before the US, which almost gives you the idea of what the intent of the ETF is. So let's look at some of the details. You know, this ETF started in 2011. It has about $350 billion in assets under management. And that's something I always like to look at to think, hey, is this a sketchy fund? Am I going to lose all of my money? Well, no, they have a ton of money in this fund, you know, millions of people investing into this fund. And so that is the size of this international exposure that Vanguard gives you. There's a lower expense ratio of just 0.07%, so it's not very expensive to own this fund over the years. Okay, so why even consider international stocks? Why would you want to invest in this ETF? And that's a good question. You know, there's been so much innovation and growth here in the United States. We have the strongest economy in the world. We have the most innovative companies in the world. You know, there is concerns about China and other places overtaking the US over time. That could happen. But as of right now, the United States is the global leader. And so the international stock idea is that maybe investing and having some exposure to these other countries will give you the ability to capture the upside as those the global order, if you will, economically speaking, maybe politically speaking, starts to change over the course of our lives. And of course, diversification is a big strategy. So having your stock investments spread out across different parts of the globe, maybe not in huge, big chunks, but some exposure isn't going to necessarily be a bad thing. And so if we look at the portfolio composition of VXUS, you can see that, you know, Europe is a huge chunk. There's a lot of exposure to that part of the world. There's also a pretty big exposure to the emerging markets, which is what we've talked about on this channel previously. And so if we actually take a look at the number of holdings, there's over 7,700 stocks inside of this exchange traded fund. So that is significant. I like to think of VXUS essentially as the VTI of the rest of the world. So we've done a lot of videos on VTI, and that is the US stock market and all the companies you could buy right there, 3,000, maybe 4,000. And VXUS is 7,700, not factoring in those. It's all the companies and stocks outside. So if we look at the top 10 stocks and the top 10 holdings here, you can actually see some names that are pretty familiar. You know, Taiwan Semiconductors, Shell, Alibaba, Tencent, Toyota. Maybe you drive a Toyota. So those are big names you've heard of, and they have a big piece here in this ETF. But something interesting I actually read was that the largest holding of this ETF is actually US dollars. About 2% is in these reserves in US dollars, which is a little bit strange when you think, hey, what's the deal? This is an international stock ETF. Well, you have to remember the US dollar for now is the global reserve currency. So many of these countries and companies all around the world have US dollars for liquidity, and that is reflected in the portfolio composition right here. Okay, so how has VXUS actually performed, right? Well, if you look at the chart from the last 5 years, you can see that it is up about 20%. And you have to remember that this allocation is not going to be a mega crazy growth stock where you're getting huge returns, something like a TQQQ, for example. That is not what this is going to be. But this will give you steady returns over time, and it will provide some dividend yield. And that's why investors typically find this as a smaller part of their overall portfolio. Now, more recently, there's been a lot of international conflict in the news. There's been a lot of turmoil over in Ukraine and Russia. There's been a lot of concern in Europe. And that's some of the exposure, of course, that you have in VXUS. And so you've seen a pullback in VXUS. And I think that over time, that will recover. And I do think some exposure to these international stocks is a wise decision. I'm going to start trying to get more exposure myself. And again, the way that I discussed VWO, so that is the Emerging Markets ETF, you can go all in on certain parts of the international global economy. There's many ways that you can go and invest in a more targeted fashion. VXUS says, hey, let's just grab everything. And very much like VTI, I think that is a pretty good strategy. It guarantees you're going to be a part of the gains of that broadly. You may miss out on certain sectors having great runs, but you're not going to miss out on the overall appreciation. And one final thought, there are a lot of people here in the United States who actually have their bets made on the international stock market. So they believe there's far better upside outside of our country and betting on a lot of these other countries. And so their portfolios may be heavily weighted in that direction. And I'd like to know if that is you, are you heavily weighted to international stocks, or do you have a lot more faith in the United States retaining and growing its economy and its companies the way that it has over the last many decades? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to respond directly to you and hear your thoughts. Okay, so that is a quick overview of the Vanguard International Stock ETF, VXUS. If you found this helpful, please consider subscribing, sharing this video with a friend, and hitting that like button. I would appreciate it. We will see you back in the next video. I'll talk to you then.